Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for a massive foundational deep dive. We're digging right into the roots of legal authority and, well, social order in the classical world.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've pulled from a really fascinating stack of sources. I mean, they cover everything, not just philosophy, but the real gritty mechanics, battlefield tactics, complex contracts.
Even things like inheritance rules and how you were supposed to conduct a funeral, really digging into the fabric of society.
Exactly. And it all orbits this huge fundamental question: where does law actually get its authority from? Is it just, what the local government decides? Civic custom, political needs?
Or is it something higher?
Yeah.
Something rooted in maybe universal principles, principles that govern nature itself. That's the core tension we're exploring.
So, our mission today is to compare the nuts and bolts, the fundamental mechanics of governance and justice in two absolute titans: Athens and Rome.
And really see how their different answers to that core question, where does law come from, how those answers shape their entire societies. We're looking at the influence of philosophy, especially Stoicism in Rome, versus Athenian democratic practice.
Right. So we've got these two parallel tracks. On one side, there's Athens, deeply democratic, very public, often quite vengeance-laced, you could say. Justice sought right out there in the open, in the arena of public opinion and honor.
And then the other track is Rome. Sprawling, transactional, incredibly formalized, intensely status conscious. A legal framework where authority was often sought in these grand philosophical ideas of natural order, but also very pragmatically in concepts of property.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's unpack this.
All right, let's start with Athens. And to understand their system of popular justice, you really have to grasp the political scaffolding built by the Cleisthenes reforms. This is late 6th century BCE.
And Cleisthenes was dealing with a society just riddled with these fierce regional loyalties, right? Political power was all tied up in specific geographical areas based on birth, tradition.
Exactly. The plain, the coast, the hill, these weren't just places. They were political factions. So his challenge was, how do you break that power? How do you dilute those loyalties without, completely tearing the city apart?
And his solution was, well, ingenious, really. He created this political structure that was deliberately artificial.
Totally artificial. He replaced the 4 old tribes, the ones based on birth and ancient lineage, with 10 brand new tribes. And these are based on geography, but a very weird, unnatural geography.
Yeah, unnatural is the word. How did that actually work on the ground?
Okay, so it relied on 2 key components, the demes and the trides. The demes were the basic building blocks, your local village, your neighborhood. These were natural units, people knew their deme.
Right, the local level.
But Cleisthenes didn't just link deme to deme within a region. That would have just reinforced the old loyalties. Instead, he created this intermediary layer, the trides.
Ah, the trides. This feels like the crucial, almost hidden piece. Our sources describe it as, what, a kind of administrative link?
Exactly. It was a grouping of demes, but, and this is key, the demes within a single trides often came from completely different geographical areas. And crucially, the trides itself, it had no independent power.
No power. How so?
It couldn't hold meetings, couldn't pass laws, couldn't own property. It had no independent constitution, no corporate existence. It was purely an administrative connector, a pivot point.
So it existed only on paper, essentially.
Pretty much. Its sole function was to link the local natural demes to the larger artificial tribes. And here's the really clever part. Each of the 10 new tribes was made up of 3 trides.
Okay.
1 trades in the city area, 1 from the coast, and 1 from the interior plain.
Ah, I see. So if I lived out in some rural coastal village in my deme, I'd suddenly find myself in a tribe, politically speaking, with people from the urban center and people from the inland hills, people I'd likely never met, possibly rivals under the old system.
Precisely. You're mixing people from different parts of Attica who had absolutely no shared local interests, no common history of worship or alliance. You force them to act together within this new tribal structure.
And that just dissolves the old regional parties, the plain, hill, coast factions. It cuts the legs out from under local political action based on those historical loyalties.
It substitutes a political organization created purely for a governmental purpose. It rewired the entire system.
It still sounds, I don't know, incredibly fragile. Like you said, too artificial to last, just based on paperwork and civic duty. How did it stick? How did it become the bedrock of Athenian democracy?
The key was stability at the bottom. While the tribes and trides were artificial constructs, they rested on the demes.
the natural local units.
Exactly. The demes kept their identity, their local administration, their festivals.
Yeah.
That deep local stability anchored the whole thing. The artificial superstructure held firm because the foundation was solid and familiar.
And it became so central, didn't it? Your deme name became part of your official identity.
Hugely important. It replaced your father's name in official context. It cemented your place in this new political order. It was a massive civic undertaking.
So this new order, this rewired democracy, it must have required a big shift in leadership too. Before Cleisthenes, and maybe for a bit after, the top magistrates, the archons, they were chosen for ability, right?
Yeah. Deliberately elected, they were expected to be capable, experienced men. They held real political weight.
But that wasn't the direction Athenian democracy ultimately went.
No, the drive was towards maximizing citizen participation and, crucially, minimizing the power of any single individual who might get too ambitious. So, years after the Battle of Marathon, a moment of huge collective pride, the system changed fundamentally.
How so?
The archons stopped being elected. They were appointed by lot.
By lot, just randomly drawn.
Yep, 9 names drawn by chance from a pool of 500 men who had previously been elected by their demes. A 2-stage process, but the final step was pure chance.
Wow, that's a staggering change. What was the thinking there? Why embrace randomness for your chief magistrates?
Well, the sources suggest it was about democratic safety and, maybe, expediency. Using the lot secured average honesty.
Average honesty.
Meaning you weren't likely to get someone using the office to build a dangerous personal power base or dominate policy long term. It prevented the emergence of political strongmen through that particular office.
But the trade-off.
The trade-off was huge. It deliberately excluded more than average ability. You weren't getting your best and brightest in those roles anymore, not by design.
So the archonship, the chief magistracy, it just faded, became almost clerical.
Exactly. It lost all its political importance basically overnight. The odds as any major political figure ending up as archon were, 500 to 1 against? It became a civic duty, an administrative function, not a power center.
So if the archons weren't leading anymore, who was? Especially in critical areas like, say, the military.
That power shifted decisively. It went to the 10 strategy, the generals.
And they were still elected.
Yes. Crucially, unlike the archons, the strategy continued to be deliberately elected year after year, specifically for their competence and ability.
Interesting. So the democracy decided political administration could handle randomness, but war couldn't.
That seems to be the logic. They needed experts to lead armies and fleets. So the strategy rose to become the real political and military leaders of Athens. They were elected, often re-elected, because they were good at what they did. They held the real power.
Okay, so we have this democratic framework. Artificially structured tribes, randomly selected magistrates for administration, and elected generals holding the practical power. Now, how did justice actually work within this system? This is where Athens seems really different.
Oh, absolutely. The Athenian law court. It wasn't like our modern image of a court at all, less about coolly applying a written code.
More like a stage.
Yeah, an intensely personal arena. And the relationship between seeking private vengeance and serving the public interest. It wasn't seen as a conflict. Often they were seen as the same thing.
Okay, now that gets really interesting. So a prosecutor in Athens wouldn't try to hide their personal grudge against the defendant.
Quite the opposite. They'd often make a point of it. They would strive to convince the huge juries, sometimes hundreds of citizens, that convicting this person served 2 goals simultaneously.
Which were?
First, achieving personal vengeance, deacon hyper hatu lebein, getting justice for oneself. And second, that doing so also served the public interest, that punishing this particular enemy improved the moral health of the city, the polis.
Wow. So having a personal axe to grind was actually a credential?
In a way, yes. We have this amazing example from a speech, Diodorus prosecuting Androtion. Diodorus doesn't just admit he hates Androtion, he emphasizes his irreconcilable enmity, adodiavlactin ejekrom, as his primary motivation for bringing the public charge. Agraphia sebeas, a charge of impiety.
He led with his hatred.
He basically argued, look, I despise this guy so much, you can be absolutely sure I will pursue this case relentlessly, and that serves you, the public, because he needs to be stopped. His personal hatred guaranteed his commitment.
So bias wasn't a disqualification, it was proof of dedication. What does that tell us about Athenian litigation? It sounds incredibly high stakes.
Profoundly high stakes. Our sources call it a gamble of submission to judgment. Litigation was expensive, it was risky, it was deeply personal. Winning wasn't just about the case, it was a public triumph. You gained honor, status, political validation from the demos.
Losing.
Losing could mean crippling shame, financial ruin, political oblivion. The court was the ultimate stage for the demos to watch the rivalries of the elite play out and to dispense honor or disgrace by delivering their verdict. It was high-stakes political theater.
And this focus on honor, reputation, controlling public perception, it reached deep into private life too, didn't it? Like with Solon's laws about funerals.
Absolutely. Solon's funerary ordinances are famous. People often think they were just about stopping people from showing off their wealth, sumptuary laws.
But it was more complicated than that.
Yeah, the sources suggest the main goal was actually social control, to prevent the funeral from becoming too aggressive.
Aggressive? How can a funeral be aggressive?
Well, imagine two powerful rival families. A big, lavish, very public funeral procession was a chance for the deceased family to make a statement, to display their wealth, their connections, their collective grief in a way that implicitly challenged their rival's status, potentially reigniting old feuds right there in the street.
Ah, so it was a potential flashpoint for political display and conflict.
Exactly. So Solon clamped down. He restricted who could attend the laying out of the body, the prothesis, or join the main procession, the ekphora. And notably, he restricted women. Women under 60 were barred unless they were related to the deceased within a very specific degree of kinship.
And that specific kinship standard, why is that detail important?
Because it shows legal continuity and precision. Solon used the exact same definition of the relevant family kinship group that Draco, the earlier lawgiver, had used decades before in his homicide laws.
The same standard for mourning rights as for dealing with a killing.
Yes. It tells us how consistently the law defined the bounds of the relevant family unit, whether the issue was murder, mourning, or controlling political tensions through ritual. It was all interconnected.
And overseeing this family unit, the household, especially the women and property within it, was the kyrios, the male head of the household.
Precisely. The kyrios, typically the father, brother, or maybe paternal grandfather, the natural kyrioi, held the legal authority. Critically, he was the one legally entitled to give a woman's hand in marriage, the enjix.
Which was essential for her children to be considered legitimate citizens.
Absolutely. It secured the lineage and the inheritance within the family unit, the oikos.
What's kind of surprising, though, is that his authority didn't just vanish once she was married and living with her husband.
No, and that's a really crucial point about the limits of female autonomy or even the husband's authority in Athens. The woman's original kyrios retained some power.
Power to do what?
He could actually step back in and initiate his daughter's or sister's divorce, even against her or her husband's wishes, and arrange her remarriage.
Really? On what grounds?
The grounds were usually quite practical and focused on the interests of her original family. Things like childlessness, if the marriage wasn't producing heirs, or open conflict between the families. Or, very commonly, if the kyrios felt the husband was mismanaging or wasting his daughter's dowry. The dowry always technically belonged to her, secured by her original family.
So it all comes back to family property, lineage, and reputation, managed through this intensely personal, public, and often feud-driven legal system. Okay, let's make the shift. From that intimate, sometimes volatile, democratic world of Athens to the colossal, formalized, bureaucratic machine of Rome. It feels like we're entering a totally different legal universe.
We really are. And a huge part of that difference lies in their philosophical starting point, where Athenian law felt very rooted in local custom, public opinion, and honor contests. Rome, especially as it developed, increasingly built its legal thinking around transactions, property, and significantly concepts of universal order.
Universal order, you mean like natural law?
Exactly. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes incredibly influential for Roman jurists. The Stoics argued that the whole cosmos is governed by a divine rational principle, the logos. Reason, essentially embedded in nature itself.
And the implication for law?
The implication was that true justice, the best kind of human law, is found when our statutes, our local rules, align with this higher, universal, eternal, natural law, the legacies naturale.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? That law isn't just what the Senate or the emperor decrees, but something that exists independently out there in nature.
It is radical, and it fundamentally shapes the Roman legal mindset. It allows them to think about law in a way that can transcend local Roman customs. It provides a framework for dealing with the incredibly diverse peoples they conquered.
How did that play out practically in something like contract law?
Well, take the contract of lease and hire. The jurist Paul, writing in the Digest, says it's found in nature and among all peoples. It's contracted not by some specific formal Latin words that only Romans know,
but just by agreement.
just by consensus, mutual understanding. same as sale and purchase. This idea comes directly from that Stoic influence concept, that basic rational principles of exchange are universal, part of the natural order, the legis gentium, or law of nations, which stems from the legis naturale.
So this philosophical underpinning helps them create laws applicable across their vast multicultural empire. How did jurists like Ulpian then define the specific duties that arose from these natural agreements, like a sale?
Ulpian lays it out very clearly, based on mutual good faith. The seller has a duty to deliver the thing. If the seller actually owned it, they have to make the buyer the new owner. If they didn't own it, maybe they were selling stolen goods, they're still obligated to protect the buyer from being evicted by the true owner.
And the buyer's duty?
Simple. Make the seller the owner of the purchase money. It's very pragmatic, very transactional. It even covers tricky situations, like knowingly selling a defective slave. The seller had specific obligations then, too. Rational, clear, focused on the exchange.
This push towards universal principles based on nature must have been essential as the empire grew. Roman expansion created this massive patchwork of different peoples and legal traditions, what our sources call legal pluralism.
Absolutely. And that presented a huge challenge for the Roman jurists. They had to manage all these conflicting local laws while still making Roman law supreme. And they also had to incorporate new legal ideas or adapt existing ones as society changed, but do it in a way that felt, well, still legitimately Roman.
They had to naturalize the changes, as one source puts it, make them seem like they always belonged.
Exactly. To maintain the authority and coherence of Roman law, even as it absorbed foreign practices or evolved internally. You see this tension between the ideal of universal natural law and the reality of Roman political dominance very clearly in how they handled land rights.
Ah, land. Always central in Rome. How did the rules differ across the empire?
It was profoundly status conscious, tied to geography. If you were dealing with land within Italy, italic land, creating certain strong property rights, like a usufruct, the right to use and profit from someone else's property, that required these incredibly formal, ancient procedures rooted in Roman civil law, things like mancipatio or iuris cessio.
Mancipatio, that wasn't just signing a piece of paper, was it? It was a whole ritual.
Oh, absolutely. Mancipatio was serious legal theater. You needed 5 Roman citizens as witnesses, plus another guy holding a bronze scale, the liberpens. The buyer would physically grasp the object or a symbol of it for land, make this very specific ritual declaration of ownership, and then strike the scale with a piece of bronze.
Wow. Very archaic. Very performative.
It was designed to create an absolutely unquestionable legal title, drawing on ancient religious and civic traditions. Heavy, formal, and exclusively Roman.
Not for land outside Italy.
Nope. On provincial land, land acquired through conquest, Gast tells us explicitly you couldn't use those formal civil law methods. To create similar rights on provincial land, all you needed were pacts and stipulations, simple agreements.
So a massive difference in legal procedure based purely on whether the land was in Italy or in a province.
It screams hierarchy, doesn't it? Despite the talk of universal natural law applying everywhere, when it came to the most valuable asset, land, the law explicitly privileged Roman soil and Roman citizens using ancient Roman forms. Provincial land was treated differently, less formally. Roman status always trumped universalism in praxis.
And this obsession with land, it wasn't just theoretical legal stuff. Land ownership was the absolute engine of Roman power and, well, conflict.
Unequivocally. Our sources state it plainly. Land was the main source of wealth. And because of that, conflicts over who owned it, especially public land, Actor Publicus, became the major axis of political activity all through the chaotic last 2 centuries of the Republic.
This wasn't just senators debating. This was real political violence, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The struggles over land reform fuel the civil wars. You see repeated attempts to pass laws limiting how much public land one wealthy individual could hold. These attempts were met with fierce resistance, political assassinations. Think of the Gracchi brothers.
And then came the proscriptions, the mass confiscations.
Exactly. During the civil wars, victors like Sulla, or later Octavian, would declare their enemies outlaws, confiscate their lands wholesale, and redistribute that property to their loyal soldiers as payment and reward. It was brutal, large-scale wealth transfer enforced by violence.
What was the long-term social impact of all this conflict over land?
It had massive consequences. Our sources suggest it led directly to the emigration of the free poor from the Italian countryside. They just couldn't compete with the huge slave-run estates, the latifundia that the wealthy were consolidating, often using confiscated land.
And at the same time,
The mass importation of slaves to work those very estates. It fundamentally changed the demographics and social structure of Italy, replacing free farmers with enslaved laborers on an enormous scale. Land conflict reshaped Roman society.
Given how central land and wealth were, the ability to control what happened to it after death must have been incredibly important. Roman inheritance law sounds complex.
Very sophisticated. They had detailed wills, of course, but they also relied heavily on other tools, particularly fideicomissa.
Fideicomissa? Those were requests made to the heir, not direct bequests.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A fideicomissum was an instruction, often informal at first, but later legally recognized, asking the main heir to pass on certain property or sums of money to a third party, or maybe use it for a specific purpose the testator wanted. It was based on fideis trust, good faith.
A way to manage assets indirectly. Were there rules about how these worked?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
The law developed specific restrictions. For instance, Ulpian notes that a bequest could be made dependent on the decision or action of someone else, like an executor saying, "K this when X happens," but it could not be made dependent on the will or whim of the heir themselves.
Why that restriction?
To ensure the testator's original intention was respected, the heir couldn't just decide, "Nah, I don't feel like giving that property away," and nullify the request. It protected the purpose of the fideicomissum.
It shows a real concern for locking down the testator's wishes. We even have an example in the sources of a father being almost, well, financially precise in his will, but not actually using a formal fideicomissum.
Ah, you mean the example Ulpian gives. The father dividing his property half to his son, a quarter each to his minor daughters.
Yeah, and he says to them essentially, "Son, be content with 200 ori for your half-daughters. You get 100 each for your quarters." Why add the specific valuation?
Ulpian explains it wasn't meant as a legally binding command forcing them to exchange money if the property values fluctuated. It was more like prudent parental advice, a specific valuation set down for his minor children.
As a safeguard.
Exactly. By stating a clear, probably quite thrifty baseline value for the estate shares right there in the will, he was preempting future disputes among the children or potential challenges about the estate's value. It reflects that Roman legal obsession with clarity, precision, and avoiding future conflict through meticulous documentation. Very practical. So this formal, complex Roman legal system, grounded partly in philosophy but obsessed with property and procedure. It created this incredibly powerful framework, but it was anything but democratic or egalitarian.
No, it seems designed almost explicitly to reinforce social hierarchy, not level it.
Absolutely. And you see that with brutal clarity in how the law dealt with the massive population of slaves.
Right. Slavery was just a fundamental reality of Roman life. How did philosophers, especially the Stoics, with their ideas about universal reason and nature, even begin to justify or rationalize legal slavery?
It required some pretty intense philosophical maneuvering. The Stoics basically created a distinction, a dissociation. They argued that the only slavery that truly mattered was moral slavery.
Original slavery, meaning what?
Meaning being enslaved to your own desires, your passions, your irrational impulses. That was the real bondage. Legal slavery, the external condition that only affected your body, well, the Stoics argued that was ultimately of no significance.
So a person could be legally enslaved but morally free, and a wealthy master could be morally enslaved to greed or anger.
That was the core idea. It allowed them to uphold their philosophy of universal reason while accepting the legal reality of bondage as merely an external circumstance irrelevant to one's true inner freedom or virtue.
That's quite a justification. How did that compare with, say, later Christian views that emerged within the empire? Did they see it differently?
Very differently. The emphasis shifted dramatically from philosophical indifference to moral judgment. Augustine, for instance, representing a developing Christian theological perspective, stated flatly that the prime cause of slavery is sin.
Sin. So it wasn't just an external circumstance anymore.
No. Augustine argued that slavery was imposed by a judgment of God as a consequence of humanity's fallen nature stemming from sin. It gave the legal status of slavery a kind of divine or moral weight that the Stoic view deliberately avoided.
So different justifications, but the legal reality remained. And the law itself seems to have put up pretty high barriers against slaves actually gaining freedom, right? Manumission wasn't just automatic.
Far from it. Manumission was possible, certainly, but the state held ultimate control and could prevent it under certain circumstances.
Such as?
Well, for one, it could be forbidden if freeing the slave was seen as detrimental to the imperial treasury. For example, if the owner was trying to dump an old or sick slave who would then become reliant on public support.
Okay, a financial concern for the state.
But perhaps more significantly, the law worked very hard to prevent slaves from being removed from the reach of judicial examination.
Judicial examination, which, for a slave, often meant torture to extract testimony.
Precisely. If a slave's testimony was needed in a court case, often under extreme duress, the law could block their manumission. This was especially true if the owner was suspected of fraud, like trying to free a slave specifically to stop them from testifying against the owner.
They really wanted to keep that tool available.
Absolutely. Olpin gives an example. A woman divorcing her husband could be legally prohibited from freeing or selling any of her slaves for a set period. Why? To ensure those slaves remained available for potential questioning, possibly under torture, if needed during the divorce proceedings. The state's need for information, obtainable through force, trumped potential freedom.
This power of the state, this willingness to use force and maintain control, regardless of philosophical niceties, it leads us straight into how Roman criminal law treated actual citizens. It wasn't one law for all, was it?
Not even close. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Roman law operated with an explicit, codified dual system of penalties. Everything depended on your social standing, your dignitas.
Dignitas. So your rank, your honor, your status literally determined how you'd be punished?
Yes. The law divided society, broadly, into the honestiores, the more honorable people, senators, knights, veterans, local elites, and the humiliores, the more humble, the lower classes, the common folk. And the punishments they faced for the same crime could be vastly different.
Can you give us a concrete example, something that really highlights this divide?
Arson is a striking one, based on texts from the Severan period. If you were convicted of arson and you were in aliquo gradu, someone of significant status.
An honestior.
Right. Your penalty, unless it was tied to treason, was typically execution, often a relatively quick beheading, or deportation, exile, usually with loss of property. Severe, yes, but relatively, well, dignified in Roman terms.
Okay. And if you committed arson but were in humiliore loco, a common person?
Your fate was public, agonizing, and designed to terrify. You were sentenced to the beasts, bestias subisa, thrown into the arena to be killed by wild animals as a public spectacle.
For the exact same crime.
For the exact same crime. The penalty was explicitly tied to your social stratum. It wasn't just about the act, it was about who committed the act.
It really feels like your legal status gave you a different level of inherent worth, or at least bodily integrity, in the eyes of the law.
That's precisely the point the sources make. The jurist Ulpian even considered it illegal damnatus, illicit if a decurion, a member of the town council elite, was wrongly condemned to the beasts. His dignitas should have protected him from that specific, degrading form of execution.
Were there other exemptions?
Yes. Veterans and active soldiers were also typically spared being thrown to the beasts, unless maybe for desertion or treason. Their service granted them a status shield. It shows how privileges of rank or service could literally save your life, or at least dictate the manner of your death, even when found guilty of a serious crime.
This deeply embedded stratification, this use of law to reinforce hierarchy, it seems linked to a broader shift in where judicial power actually resided in Rome, especially under the Empire.
Absolutely. There was a major consolidation of power. In the Republic, the praetors were central figures in civilian justice. They were magistrates elected annually, issuing edicts, presiding over courts in the forum. They were the public face of law and equity.
But that changed
dramatically. As the empire solidified, the praetors' courts became increasingly irrelevant, even deserted, as the historian Gibbon noted. Real judicial power flowed upward.
Upwards to where?
It concentrated, perhaps alarmingly, under the praetorian prefect.
The commander of the emperor's personal guard, the Praetorian Guard.
The very same.
Okay.
This office evolved from purely military to having vast administrative and judicial authority. The prefect's court was vigorous, permanent, and directly linked to imperial power, eclipsing the old civilian courts.
Putting the head of what's essentially the military police in charge of civilian justice, that sounds ripe for abuse. Did it lead to political manipulation?
Almost inevitably. We see examples even early in the Principate. Titus, when he was serving as Praetorian prefect under his father, Emperor Vespasian. He apparently used his position to secure guilty verdicts against his political enemies, not in a regular court, but at the Praetorian camp, a military setting. And then he'd just get his father, the emperor, to confirm the death sentences.
So military intimidation backing up legal judgments, rubber stamped by the emperor.
It set a dangerous precedent. Military power and imperial will openly overriding or manipulating the legal process for political ends.
And perhaps the most chilling example of where this could lead, the ultimate illustration of how fragile even Roman formalized law could be against raw power, involves the great jurist Papinian himself.
Papinian, one of the giants of Roman law, hugely respected for his intellect and integrity. His death in 212 AD is, well, it's a grim story.
What happened?
He fell afoul of the emperor Caracalla. After Caracalla murdered his own brother Geta, Papinian apparently refused to publicly justify the killing. The Praetorian Guard, loyal to Caracalla, turned on Papinian. They essentially condemned him by acclamation, just shouting him down.
Condemned by the troops.
Yes, and they brought him before Caracalla. The emperor's response, according to the sources, was utterly revealing about where power truly lay. He basically said to the soldiers, "I rule for you, not for myself, and I yield to you both as accusers and as judges."
He deferred to the guard over his own chief jurist.
He did. And Papinian, the embodiment of Roman legal reason, was killed right there in the emperor's presence on the guard's demand.
Wow. So what does that ultimately tell us about the authority of this elaborate, codified, philosophically grounded Roman law?
It tells us that despite its sophistication, despite its claims to tap into universal natural law, Roman legal authority was never fully independent from raw political and military power. When the principles of justice or the rulings of jurists clashed with the emperor's needs or the demands of his soldiers, power won. Political expediency held the final, often fatal veto over legal principle. #outro.
So we've traced quite a journey here. Two incredibly influential classical societies, but with such vastly different approaches to law and order. We started in Athens with its intense, very public democratic system where law felt inseparable from public opinion, from competition for honor, even from personal vengeance. Justice was almost a performance.
Yeah, performance for honor within the community.
Right.
And we contrasted that sharply with the Roman Empire. They drew on Stoic ideas initially, aiming for a law grounded in universal reason, the naturale, especially for things like contracts and dealing with foreigners.
But in practice?
In practice, it evolved into this highly professionalized, incredibly detailed system focused on property, transactions, and, crucially, reinforcing social hierarchy. Justice was formalized, yes, but it was overtly stratified by status. The very idea of what law was and where its authority came from really shifted dramatically between these two worlds.
This whole deep dive really underscores something important, I think. When you encounter any complex system of rules or knowledge, whether it's ancient legal codes, historical accounts, maybe even modern corporate policies or professional guidelines, it's worth remembering that the structure itself, the way it's organized, the things it prioritizes, that structure is often a direct reflection of underlying social power dynamics and competing values. What mattered most? In Athens, maybe honor and the demos. In Rome, property and dignitas.
That's a great takeaway. And maybe one final thought to leave people with, circling back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Think about those Cleisthenic reforms in Athens, that use of artificial political geography, the tribes mixing people from different areas, specifically designed to break up old loyalties, the traditional parties of the plain, hill, and coast.
Making centralized control easier by dissolving those old solidarities.
Exactly. So the provocative thought is, to what extent do modern structures, maybe political redistricting, corporate reorganizations that shuffle teams and reporting lines, even online community structures, use similar tactics, creating artificial boundaries, new groupings, potentially to deliberately dissolve older, pre-existing forms of local action, community feeling, or solidarity?
Making centralized direction or control perhaps a little easier to maintain by breaking those natural connections. Definitely something to chew on.
Food for thought.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for digging through all of this with us today. It's been fascinating.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into another stack of sources. Thanks for joining us.